My name is Maeve Cook. I'm a professor at UCD, University College Dublin, in the School of Philosophy. And I'm going to have a conversation this afternoon with Professor Lea Ypi from the London School of Economics and Political Science, who is shortly going to deliver the 2023 Royal Institute of Philosophy, UCD School of Philosophy lecture on for a critical philosophy of history. But before that, we're just going to have an informal chat where Lea has kindly agreed to respond to some of my questions. So Lea, you're very welcome. It's really wonderful that you've come over here. Lea has just said that in BBC interviews, they always start by asking what she's had for breakfast, but I am going to start with a question about you as a political theorist and philosopher. As you're a political theorist, political philosopher who has published on a wide range of contemporary issues, including political legitimacy, critique of capitalism, migration, colonialism, the role of political parties, revolution, and much more. You're also interested in intellectual history, and you've published extensively on Kant, Hegel, and Marx. Looking back on your intellectual trajectory, which thinkers would you single out as having been most important for you?
Thank you, Maeve. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think the influences have changed over the course of the years. If I were to start chronological, I'd say that Kant was the first philosopher that I was really interested in, and the German idealist tradition as part of that, responses to Kant, the debates around Kant, which naturally then led me to Hegel and Marx, and also 20th century continental philosophy, which is something that I then didn't pursue when I started my PhD, because I started in a more Anglophile institution. So this was all during my studies in Rome at the University of Rome, La Sapienza. And when I then moved to an Anglo-American department or Anglo-American oriented department, there was much less continental philosophy, if any at all there. And so the interest became naturally more contemporary political theory. And with that, debates around John Rawls's thought, global justice, and where political theory also became applied. And so questions of migration and democracy and so on. I've also been really interested in 20th century critical theory. And I would say that that's maybe where I feel most at home in the 20th century and the 21st century, perhaps because I see it as one of the few surviving branches of philosophy that really tries to combine these two strands, which are otherwise seem quite isolated from each other. And so the thought of Jürgen Habermas has been very important to me, and Axel Honneth, Rainer Forst, sort of third generation Frankfurt School, and a number of other authors who speak to that tradition and develop their thought within that tradition, including yourself. So.
Well, it's wonderful. It's music to my ears because, as you know well, but not everybody knows, I have a long background in Frankfurt School critical theory, and I don't like to be associated only with that body of theorizing, but it really has been formative for me, and I feel very much at home, and I'm very in that tradition. I'm very happy about the way it has developed. So by answering that question, you've actually answered my second question, which was what contemporary thinkers are most influential for you, and what you said about analytic philosophy, the more, let's say, mainstream liberal political theoretical tradition background. Before that, continental philosophy and Kant, critical theory. That gives us a good picture, I think, of your intellectual, very broad intellectual horizons.
Yeah, and in contemporary philosophy, I think I'm really interested in reinterpretations of Kant and Kant thought. And so anyone who works on Kant is someone that I read with great pleasure. And in contemporary political theory, I would say, yes, very much critical theory, and also some developments in Marxist thought. Often these things overlap. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But I find the approaches that are more critical of political liberal societies, the ones that I'm more interested in.
Many of us have read your memoir, Free, Coming of Age at the End of History, which paints a vivid and, for me, often disturbing picture of growing up in first communist and then post-communist Albania in the 1980s and 1990s. The book, published by Penguin in 2021, has received considerable international acclaim. It's been translated into 20 languages, I read. But readers of the book, I come back to the book, but readers of the book will know something about your school teachers who had a strong impact on you. When you left Albania in the 1990s, as you just mentioned, you went to Italy, studied in Rome, and you studied in the UK. Were there any particular people there, teachers there, who had the same kind of impact on you, though of course at a later stage of your development?
Yeah, it was for me, the time I spent studying philosophy in Rome was really formative. And I'd say actually those teachers were the ones that had the greatest impacts, perhaps because it was early on, perhaps because I had no background in philosophy whatsoever. And so I started learning everything from scratch. But I did my first dissertation under Professor Mario Reale, who was a Machiavelli, Rousseau, and Hobbes scholar. I worked also with Professor Paola Rodano, Professor Filippo Gonnelli. These were both modern philosophy scholars, so in one case Descartes and in another case Kant. And that entire tradition in Rome, La Sapienza, was much more historical and really focused on the classics, on reading of the classics. But it was my first approach to philosophy. And although it was really hard when I started, because as I say, I had no background, so I was coming from Albania, where before the fall of communism, there was philosophy, but it was very much Marxist-Leninist dialectical materialism, so with a very, very small range of texts translated and a very narrow approach to these texts, very dogmatic. When I was studying in the 90s, actually that had also been abolished. And we had 1 year of philosophy in school where it wasn't historical at all. It was just done by topics. So people would give you, one topic. And of course, without any tradition, without any background, it was really hard. So I remember it was really my first years of studying philosophy were so hard that I had to move and was doing only formal logic and philosophy of science for a while, because it was the only one where I had some more basics coming from the Albanian system. And then slowly began to read the big books, Plato and Aristotle and Descartes and Kant and Hegel and so on. And those scholars and those approaches were really, really important and have stayed with me.
And it's very interesting, and particularly in light of your own work, which has this manifests this appreciation for intellectual history. Were you always interested in history in general, or do you think that the Rome experience, your studies there, pushed you in that direction?
Yeah, I think it was more the latter. I was interested in philosophy, and as a teenager, I was very curious, and in part because we weren't doing it at school, there were not many texts translated. All the big classics of philosophy hadn't really been translated during communism in Albania. So as I said, it was a very narrow range, which had also disappeared when I was growing up. When I was a teenager, I used to get French or Italian books, just, random, started reading Socrates' Apology or whatever I could really find. But I was also really interested in philosophical literature. So literature with the philosophical angle. I was a big reader of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and loved these big 19th century novels that raise philosophical questions. So I was always interested in philosophy. And when I went to Rome, the approach there, although there were both, the one that I was somehow ended up with was the more historical one, because it was always reading philosophy in combination with history and with events and with culture more broadly, so with developments in art and literature, and that's what made it very interesting for me.
You studied literature and philosophy in Rome. So has literature, clearly you've written a memoir, which is really, from a literary point of view, really quite amazing. But have you otherwise left literary studies behind you?
I don't know. I suppose as I began my career in academic philosophy, yes, it sort of receded in the background. I started, I picked philosophy in a way because I was interested in a certain kind of literature and thought that to be a good writer, a good literary writer, one had to be a good philosopher. Otherwise, one gets lost in details that aren't very interesting to the world. And so I felt that I needed to study philosophy, and I picked it because, as I say, I was interested in literature. And the kind of literature that I was interested in was, as I say, these big 19th century novels, classics of, French, German, Russian literature, Italian, and so on. But I was also interested in authors like Dante, for example, when I was studying in Rome. And again, that was intellectually such a vibrant environment because you could study these big books of literature in the original, and there was such an amazing tradition of scholarship around critical literature and reading literary texts in a critical way. So that was also, I never saw them as completely separate, even though unfortunately when I started my PhD, one became much less relevant just because the norms of Anglo-American academia seemed very, very different, and somehow you had to pick and choose. But I never really saw them as that isolated until I really ended in a kind of Anglo-Saxon environment.
Thank you. This question also touches on things you've said. Your memoir, Free, Coming of Age at the End of History, the first page describes you vividly hugging a bronze statue of Stalin in the gardens of the Palace of Culture in Tirana. So readers of the book will know about your journey within communist Albania and in post-communist Albania. What I want to ask you is what your intellectual relationship with communism and Marxist theory is today.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very complicated answer for me, and it's difficult because I came to Italy from Albania from a place of complete hostility to that entire tradition, which was seen in Albania as being responsible for all the tragedies of the 20th century that people had experienced, a lot of the economic and material hardship and so on. And then I discovered a very different Marx and a very different Marxist tradition through these Italian professors and this Italian environment that I was describing. And that's also in part because of the particular left tradition that there was in Italian universities, which comes out of Gramsci and comes out of the Italian Communist Party, which was very unusual in its in the European configuration of communist parties in the 20th century. It was sui generis. For a start, it was critical, but still communist. And it was very connected to the tradition of Eurocommunism that in communist Albania was seen as anti-communist. And so I remember one of the books when I went recently to the villa of Albanian former dictator Enver Hoxha in the south, there was a library with books there. And there was, I think, this book which said in the title, Eurocommunism is anti-communism. And it was an entire critique of Berlinguer, of that whole Italian tradition, which had been really important to me when I was studying, because it made me reflect on liberalism and shortcomings of the liberal tradition from a very distinctive angle, which wasn't the Soviet Marxist angle that I was used to and that I was much more hostile to, but was also in some ways not complacent about liberalism and about the shortcomings of liberalism. And so it was, so that's why my relationship with Marxism is mediated by these two experiences. On the one hand, my childhood in Albania, and in particular in a dissident family, anti-communist family, who had people who went to prison and were persecuted, and some of my family members were killed during communism. So it was a tradition of a place of tragedy of the 20th century lived in the family. And on the other hand, when I went to university, the discovery of this intellectual tradition, where in a way I wasn't happy, or where I ended up was in the place of difficulty and criticism with both, because in Albania it was as though only the history of Marxism mattered, and the philosophy, because of the wrong history in a way, or because of history gone wrong, philosophy could also completely be put to one side as this big mistake that should never be repeated. On the other hand, in Western Europe, in Marxist circles, you had the opposite feeling that only the philosophy mattered, and then the history was always the history of these weird, faraway places where things had gone wrong, maybe because people were backward, or maybe they didn't really understand it, or maybe they didn't really know how to realize these ideals and put them to practice. And that was also uncomfortable for me because, you know, as a Kant Hegelian Marxist, ideas never come into the world pure. They're always there, but then they always get picked up by contingent actors, and so there are always flaws there and tragedies of action that can't be avoided. So in a way, it was always this effort to try and read the philosophy with the history in mind, but also try and care about ideas and see what one can learn from the ideas and learn from the history in both a way that could learn from these mistakes and tragedies of the past, but also think about what the ideas could contribute to a criticism of the societies in which we live and how we can take them forward in ways that are better.
And at this moment in time, what ways do you think Marxist thought, thinking specifically, not just Marxism, but Marxist thinking, what has it got to offer us in 2023 in a time of multiple catastrophe?
Well, I think there are several contributions. I mean, we could talk about the methodological contribution. So the idea that we start with practices, and of course that also has a tradition. There's also a tradition in philosophy that thinks about, what is dialectic and how we engage dialectically with the world. We start with conflicts and we start with the problems that surround us, and we try and reflect on what kind of commitments they show and they reveal, and what are the shortcomings and what are the problems of society. And then we work our way with a combination of philosophy and history. And I think that's that methodological contribution that is not just of Marx, but of that whole tradition that Marx comes from, which is this German idealist tradition that I think starts with Kant and with the critical method, and this attempt to fight both dogmatism and skepticism is still really relevant to just as an approach, as a kind of methodological approach to the world in which we live. But also more empirically, I think what I find interesting in the Marxist tradition is the fact that the agents of injustice aren't just states, that there are narratives that try to explain the world in which we live and try to explain globalization, not by focusing just on who holds power and law, but also the underlying structural agents that are in some ways connected to states and to other institutions. And so the market is really important. And then we need to see what is going on in the market and who are the agents that suffer from domination in the market. And I think that approach is distinctive to Marxism and risks being lost sometimes in liberal discourses that only focus on societies that are more developed or less developed, and perhaps put less emphasis on the analysis of the market actors as important agents of global injustice. And I think that's so an effort to understand the distinctive nature of the capitalist predicament that we all are shaped by, and trying to understand the patterns of domination and oppression within capitalist societies. I think that comes again from a Marxist approach and is still very relevant to understand, why is it that these states also struggle? Why can't they deliver justice then if they're the only ones that are responsible for justice? And I think that integrates mainstream approaches in liberal political theory in ways that are valuable.
Thank you. I mean, listening to you, I really, you really feel as though your time at Italy was just it was a very helpful mediation. At least you wouldn't be the kind of thinker you are if you had gone straight, say, to the UK, or if you just stayed in Italy, perhaps either. So maybe those combination of influences have been very important to you.
Yes, also because I think, although my time in Italy, as I said, was really important and very formative, there was at some point a limitation in that it was too historical. And sometimes there was a risk that you talked about these big classics and these authors in the history of political thought as these kind of archaeological relics that we approach, but we can't criticize them, we can't appropriate them. And in some ways, there's something to be said for the much more disrespectful way in which contemporary Anglo-American analytical philosophy approaches tradition, which is, we take what we need and to work out the problems that we have for ourselves, and we start with the problem. And I think perhaps the middle way, the dialectical solution, is the one that I found myself most congenial, because I didn't want to ignore history, but I also didn't want to be a slave of history. I wanted to also think about how we could appropriate and how we could reflect and use history for our purposes, for the present, for resolving the dilemmas that we face.
Listening, it sounds like a happy story. I know it wasn't at all happy at various times, and nobody's life is always happy. So you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but I was wondering whether there were any challenges, particular challenges you faced either in Italy or in the UK or elsewhere when you left Albania as a young adult, embarking on studies, either because of your Albanian upbringing and your being acculturated in a communist country, or because of your gender, or whatever.
Yeah, there were lots of them. I think the greatest were when I was younger and in Italy, and perhaps just after that as well. And I'd say the greatest were financial. I think sometimes people don't appreciate how much just money constrains you. I went to Italy on a very, very small scholarship, and it was so small that I couldn't really afford anything more than the meals that we were given by the university cafeteria. And that meant that I couldn't do any of the enrichment activities and all the things that all my peers did. You know, if you wanted to do philosophy, you had to learn German. And I, at some point, became really interested, wanted to learn German, and discovered that actually you have to pay money for the Goethe Institute, and it just was not possible to afford that. So the real difficulty was financial, and just really barely making it to the end of the month with that very small scholarship that I had, in an environment where I think sometimes humanities degrees are often the place where privileged people end up, because there is very much awareness that, you know, you may not be able to find a job, and then you need a family that can support you. And I didn't come from a working class family in Albania. My family was relatively normal, but it's just, you know, being normal in Albania doesn't mean being normal in Italy. So there's these differences of societal income and how much, you know, what you can. And so I didn't have any support from the family in Italy. So that was really hard. And in some ways, a lot of my choices, including to end up doing a PhD in Florence at the European University Institute, it wasn't an authentic choice, in that I wasn't sitting there and thinking, okay, I can apply to these 15 places and I'll go to whichever one. There were some places that I just could not afford to apply to. And in the case of England, I couldn't even afford to pay for the money that you needed to pay for the English exam. So it was that basic. And so you could just go to wherever you got funding to go and do the things that you got funding to do. And sometimes that also shaped the kinds of topics that I was pursuing that weren't necessarily things that I would have picked. But if there was a scholarship coming there, and this is not at all unique condition, it's shared with a lot of people who come from that background. We just usually go where the scholarship takes us. And it was the first time when I started my job at the LSE where I was really free from having to think about my theoretical choices being made constrained by financial choices. The other thing that was really different and difficult for me was that I had never really thought of myself as an Albanian. So in my family, class differences, because of in part this communist or anti-communist history in the family, were much more important than national differences. It was really about what kind of family you came from rather than what kind of state you came from. And when I moved to Italy in the late 90s, it wasn't a kind of place that cared about being a particular citizen of a particular social group in Albania. You were an Albanian, and that was it. And this was at the time in which there was lots of discrimination and stereotyping and scare stories about Albanian migrants in Italy in the news every day. And so there was a lot of prejudice and stereotype connected to that, and to the discovery that somehow you're marked by your nationality, and that people make assumptions about you regardless of what you are. And the third difficulty, I'd say, was just philosophy, actually, and studying a degree that I hadn't done before and in a different language. And that's also stayed with me when I moved to my PhD at the EUI, where it was an Anglo-Saxon environment in English. And so it was different language yet again, and a different methodology, and writing was very different. And so it was always these transitions connected to having to move from one academic culture to a very, very different academic culture with no preparation.
How important do you think it is for anyone today, but let's say students or people working, hoping to work in the area of philosophy, but let's say anybody who's interested in ideas, to speak several languages? I mean, you speak a lot of languages, but let's say more than one, because it seems to me increasingly that young people speak only one language, and that's usually English. Yeah, I mean, these they come from an English-speaking environment. And otherwise, they probably speak two, but English is, they might speak many. But there is a trend towards people speaking English only, or their mother tongue and English.
Yeah, and I think the answer to this question would have changed, you know, before Google Translate and before ChatGPT and before the kind of automatization of society, where, you know, you have much more easy access to languages. And so sometimes it's more about being open in your mind to different languages, even if you don't necessarily speak the language. Or so I think the question is really about how important is it to be open to them. And to me, it's crucial because the language is a key to a world. And there are many things that remain unsaid, swept under the carpet, making a transition from one world to another world. And without that openness to different languages and to different cultures, there are a lot of things that one inherits, lots of prejudices and lots of ways of looking at the world that are just inevitably the mainstream ones. And with English, I worry that people are inevitably inheriting the dominant categories of understanding the world just by inhabiting this one and only language and without being open to other ways of seeing the world. Sometimes I think it's not as important. I mean, maybe, of course it's important to learn languages, but now there are so many other ways of accessing texts that are not in your language where you have to have the curiosity, but it's possible. I mean, I'm writing this now new book on my grandmother, and quite a lot of the literature is in Turkish, and I don't speak Turkish, but it's possible now with, camera and a scanner to actually put it in front of a Turkish book and read what's being written in it. And, it's not perfect, but it's an approximation to something that would otherwise be completely inaccessible. And I think the more of that there is, and the more one can bring into one's life, the more enriching it is.
I agree. It's amazing what these new tools, and it's incredible. And I agree with so much of what you're saying, but that's neither here nor there. You mentioned your grandmother, so I don't want to spoil the book, your memoir, Free, Coming of Age at the End of History. For those who haven't yet read it, I want really to warmly recommend this book to everybody. So I don't want to spoil it by saying very much about your grandmother, but she seems to be a really extraordinary woman. Would I say a few words about your grandmother?
Yeah, she was the most important person in my life, I think, both emotionally and personally. And so in my development as a human being, but also intellectually, I would say she had a huge impact on me. She came from, she was born in Salonika to an elite family of high administrators of the Ottoman Empire at the point in which the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, and states were all assigned and populations were all assigned to the different states that went under their name. So she'd never been to Albania, but she was born to an Albanian-speaking family in this multicultural cosmopolitan city at a point in which the world in which her family flourished was collapsing. And she went to Albania in some ways in search of an identity from this elite background. And she married my grandfather, who ended up being a political prisoner, and her life changed completely, went from being this life of privilege and wealth and traveling to a life of this isolated single mother who was completely on her own in Albania because all her family was in Greece, who had to work in the fields and who lost everything and who had to follow this husband who was in prison for 15 years. And one of the things that stood out about her is that every time I asked her, oh, that must have been really hard. How did you manage not just the difficulty, but also the sharpness of the contrast between, being here and then being down here? And how did you manage this much oppression in your life? She would always say, I was never oppressed. And this to me, and I said, how did you cope with the unfreedom? And she said, I was never unfree. And when I asked her to explain, she said, well, it's about remaining a moral person, and the freedom is not the freedom to pick this or that, it's the freedom to keep your integrity and your dignity as a human being. And when I said that she has had the greatest influence on me intellectually, it's because I think that there's something to that theory of freedom. And in fact, it's the one that I have then been researching and reading, and being a Kant scholar, it's all about moral agency and the transcendental nature of freedom as that which shapes all our moral choices. And that's the first time I heard those kinds of theories. It was through her and not through any exposure. I mean, she wasn't a particularly philosophical person, but somehow her life and her way of thinking about life had ended up in this place, and was one that was really important for me because it also helped me then navigate the different transitions in which I found myself, and also cope with a lot of difficulties, with the shortcomings, with the material difficulties, with the discrimination, with just navigating a world that was increasingly, or seemed to be increasingly, hostile, with the help of this idea that actually you can always keep your integrity and you can keep doing what you think is the right thing to do, even if the world doesn't turn out the way you want it to turn out.
What you've just said, and you and your grandmother have just led me very nicely to my last question, which is, in your memoir, you write that more changes occurred in your life in December 1990 than all the previous years of your life combined. You say that communism disappeared, not just as an ideal or a system of rule, but also as a category of thought. And in that context, you write, I'm going to quote this passage from your book, page 137. Only one word was left, freedom. It featured in every speech on television, in every slogan barked out in rage on the streets. When freedom finally arrived, it was like a dish served frozen. We chewed little, swallowed fast, and remained hungry. Some wondered if we had been given leftovers. Others noted they were simply cold starters. Would you like to comment on the title of your memoir in light of what you just wrote there?
Yeah, it was a nod to Fukuyama's idea on the end of history, and in particular the thesis that with the fall of the Berlin Wall and with the collapse and with the victory of Western powers in the Cold War, only the one liberal capitalist idea of freedom was left as the viable one, and there was going to be, and it was the end of history, because not history as a sort of set of events, and which would obviously continue, but this idea that philosophically there was anything to be said for any other idea of freedom. And the title of my book was ironic in part because I remember when I read that article, there's a little sentence there that says, of course, you know, this Hegelian thesis could be challenged by the fact that this is not the history of everyone. And if we want to know what we think about history, we don't ask Albanians what they think. And I remember reading this and I thought, well, my book could be an Albanian that tells you actually, yeah, this is how it looked from inside. This is how it looked from this particular perspective. And this is what we would have made of Hegel plus Fukuyama. So it was in one way a kind of direct nod in this sense, but in a more general way also an effort to say that actually there is a distinction between freedom as an ideal and freedom as an ideology, and that perhaps what we had and what we received in 1990 was very much just a different ideological understanding of a different kind of freedom that to some extent overlapped with the previous ideological ones, to some extent was a complete subversion of our categories, but in many ways also full of ways of interpreting the world and telling us stories, some of which aren't as credible as those who make them or tell them seem to think they are. And that what we need to know is really how to distinguish, how to tell them apart, how to cultivate critical thinking and a kind of ideal of freedom that can flourish in and through critical thinking, and distinguish that from the ideology and from the propaganda and from the fake news that we're surrounded by. And that in that sense, I don't think the story of freedom has been told, and I don't think it overlaps with the freedom of liberal capitalist societies.
And your grandmother's life and her affirmation of herself as a free person adds another layer to the idea of freedom as it is in your book. So that's really a very nice dimension to the freedom as ideology, freedom as idea. It's a concretization, if you like, of one facet of the idea of freedom. So read her book. It's a wonderful book. And read her scholarly writings as well, because Professor Ypi is really a remarkable political philosopher and theorist. And thank you very much for talking to us this afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.